The morning sun bathed the sprawling Pato estate in a golden hue, casting long shadows on the manicured lawns. Birds chirped merrily from the tall jacaranda trees that lined the driveway, their purple blossoms painting the sky with a serene beauty. The scent of freshly brewed Kenyan coffee wafted through the open windows of the grand mansion, mingling with the fragrant aroma of Mrs. Pato's gardenias, which were in full bloom. Inside, the Pato family gathered for breakfast in the sun-drenched dining room. The room, with its high ceilings, elegant chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows, was a testament to the wealth and refinement that defined the Pato name. The table was laden with an array of breakfast delights, fresh fruits, pastries, eggs prepared in every style, and, of course, the rich coffee that Mr. Pato insisted on having every morning. At the head of the table sat Mr. Pato, a man in his early 60s, with graying hair that spoke of wisdom and experience. His broad shoulders and firm jawline still bore the strength of a man who had built an empire with his bare hands. His presence commanded respect, not just from his family, but from everyone who had the privilege of knowing him. He was a self-made man, having risen from humble beginnings in a small village to become one of the most powerful and influential businessmen in Nairobi. His name was synonymous with success, integrity, and generosity. Across from him sat Mrs. Pato, the epitome of grace and elegance. Her smooth, flawless skin glowed in the morning light. She wore a light silk robe that matched the soft lavender of the gardenias she loved so much. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, revealing the delicate earrings that dangled from her ears, an anniversary gift from Mr. Pato years ago. She was the socialite of the family, always hosting grand parties, attending charity galas, and ensuring that the Pato name was always in the best circles. Yet, despite her social commitments, she was a devoted wife and mother, always present, always caring. Their 3 children, Tammy, Kamal, and Zoe, completed the picture of a perfect family. Tammy, the eldest, was in her early 30s, with her father's sharp mind and her mother's beauty. She had taken after her father, joining the family business right after university. She was ambitious, intelligent, and driven, determined to prove that she was capable of one day taking over the empire her father had built. But beneath her confident exterior, Tammy carried the weight of the expectations placed upon her. She loved her family deeply, but the pressure to succeed, to live up to the Pato name, was a constant burden. Kamal, 2 years younger, was the polar opposite of his sister. He had inherited the Pato charm and good looks, but not the ambition. He was carefree, more interested in fast cars and parties than in board meetings and profit margins. To Kamal, life was meant to be enjoyed, not spent in the pursuit of wealth. He had no interest in the family business, much to his father's disappointment. Yet, despite his carefree nature, Kamal loved his family deeply and would do anything to protect them, even if he didn't always show it. Zoe, the youngest, was still in university, studying fine arts. She was the creative soul of the family, with a talent for painting and a love for all things beautiful. Unlike her siblings, Zoe had no interest in business or wealth. Her world was one of colors, emotions, and creativity. She often felt like an outsider in her own family, with her dreams and passions so different from those of her parents and siblings. Yet, despite this, Zoe was loved and cherished by all, her innocence and passion for life a refreshing contrast to the seriousness that often hung over the Pato household. As they sat around the table that morning, the family chatted about the day ahead. Tammy spoke about a new project at the company, her voice calm but her eyes betraying her excitement. Kamal, half listening, was more interested in his phone, planning his next adventure. Zoe, as always, was lost in her thoughts, sketching something on her napkin with a small smile on her lips. Mrs. Pato sipped her coffee, watching her children with a mixture of pride and concern. And Mr. Pato, ever the patriarch, listened quietly, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched his family. To an outsider, the Patos were the perfect family. Wealthy, powerful, and united. They had everything one could ever want: a beautiful home, successful careers, and the respect of society. But beneath the surface, there were cracks, small and almost invisible, but they are nonetheless. Tammy's ambition often clashed with Kamal's indifference, and Zoe's artistic dreams seemed out of place in a family so focused on business and wealth. Mrs. Pato, always the mediator, often found herself caught between her husband's expectations and her children's desires. And Mr. Pato, though he appeared calm and content, had begun to notice these cracks. He loved his family more than anything, and the thought of them drifting apart, of losing the unity they had always shared, filled him with a quiet dread. He had built his empire for them, to ensure that they would always be secure, always together. But now, as he looked around the table, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He had always prided himself on being able to solve any problem, to fix anything that was broken. But this was different. After breakfast, Mr. Pato excused himself and retreated to his study, where he often went to think. He closed the door behind him and took a seat in his large leather chair, his mind racing. The family he had worked so hard to build and protect was starting to show signs of strain, and it troubled him deeply. But how could he be sure of their loyalty, their commitment, their ability to handle the responsibilities that came with the Pato name? An idea began to form in his mind, one that was risky, but necessary. He would pretend to be ill, seriously ill. It would be the ultimate test of his family's loyalty and strength. How would they react? Who would step up? Who would falter? He needed to know the answers, even if it meant causing them temporary pain and confusion. That afternoon, as the family gathered in the living room for tea, Mr. Pato made his announcement. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I've been feeling unwell lately," he began, his deep voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "It's nothing serious, but I've decided to take a step back from the business for a while. I need to rest, to take care of myself." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Tammy's mind raced. She had noticed her father looking tired lately, but she had dismissed it, thinking it was just the stress of work. Kamal, for the first time that day, put down his phone, his carefree demeanor replaced by concern. Zoe looked up from her sketch, her eyes wide with worry. Mrs. Pato was the first to speak. "What do you mean, Pato?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of fear. "Are you saying you're ill?" "It's nothing to worry about," Mr. Pato reassured her, but the look in his eyes told a different story. "I just need some time. Tammy, I need you to take on more responsibilities at the company. Kamal, I expect you to step up as well." Tammy nodded, though her mind was spinning. She had always wanted more responsibility, but not like this. Kamal, on the other hand, looked uneasy. He had never been interested in the family business, and the thought of having to step into his father's shoes filled him with dread. After a few more words, Mr. Pato excused himself and retreated to his study, leaving his family in stunned silence. Mrs. Pato watched him go, her heart heavy with worry. She had always known her husband as a strong and determined man, but now, he seemed vulnerable, and it frightened her. Inside his study, Mr. Pato sat down and took a deep breath. He knew that his decision to fake an illness was a gamble, but it was one he felt he had to take. He needed to see his family's true colors, to know who they really were when faced with adversity. As he looked out the window at the setting sun, he wondered how they would react in the days to come. Would they rise to the challenge, or would the cracks in their family deepen into chasms? Only time would tell. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Pato household was tense. The usual lively breakfast conversation was replaced by an uneasy silence as the family grappled with the news of Mr. Pato's supposed illness. The grand dining room, with its elegant chandeliers and towering windows, felt colder, despite the warm sunlight streaming in. Mrs. Pato sipped her coffee, her eyes downcast, lost in thought. Tammy, seated next to her, stirred her tea absently, her mind far from the table. Kamal was unusually quiet, while Ziri barely touched her food, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a somber demeanor. After breakfast, Tammy retreated to her room, her thoughts racing. She had always been close to her father, sharing his passion for the family business and his relentless drive for success. But now, with him stepping back due to his health, Tammy felt a heavy burden on her shoulders. She knew she had to take charge, to prove herself worthy of the Pato name. But the thought of doing it without her father by her side filled her with anxiety. As she paced her room, Tammy's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Kamal, asking to meet her in the garden. Curious and slightly apprehensive, she agreed. She found him waiting near the rose bushes, his usual carefree expression replaced with a serious look. Kamal was the easygoing one, the one who never seemed to take anything seriously. But today, there was a hardness in his eyes that she had never seen before. "Tammy," Kamal began, his voice low and strained, "we need to talk about that." Tammy nodded, unsure of where this was going. "I know, Kamal. It's a lot to take in, but we have to be strong for him." Kamal shook his head, his expression troubled. "That's just it, Tammy. I don't think Dad is as sick as he's making it seem." Tammy stared at him, stunned by his words. "What are you saying? You think he's lying about being ill?" Kamal hesitated, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know for sure. But think about it, he's always been so strong, so determined. I can't imagine him suddenly becoming too weak to manage the business. And the way he announced it, something doesn't add up." Tammy felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. "How can you say that, Kamal? This is our father we're talking about. He's given everything for this family. Why would he lie about something like this?" Kamal met her gaze, his expression hard. "Maybe because he's testing us, Tammy. Maybe he wants to see how we'll handle things without him. You know how Dad is, he's always testing people, always trying to see what they're made of." Tammy felt a cold chill run down her spine. The thought of her father pretending to be ill just to test their loyalty seemed far-fetched, but at the same time, it was disturbingly plausible. She knew how much her father valued strength and resilience, how he had always pushed them to be their best. But to go this far? "I don't know, Kamal," Tammy said quietly, her anger giving way to doubt. "It just seems too cruel." Kamal sighed, his expression softening. "I don't want to believe it either, Tammy. But we have to be prepared. If he's really sick, we need to step up. But if he's not, we need to be ready for whatever he's planning." Tammy nodded, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe in her father, to trust that he would never deceive them like this. But Kamal's words had planted a seed of doubt that she couldn't ignore. As they walked back to the house, Tammy couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was very wrong. She loved her father dearly, and the thought of him testing their loyalty in such a way felt like a betrayal. But at the same time, she knew Kamal had a point. Their father was a man who valued loyalty and strength above all else. Would he really go so far as to pretend to be ill just to test them? Later that day, Mrs. Pato found herself alone in the grand living room, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the ornate furniture. She had always been the glue that held the family together, smoothing over conflicts and ensuring that the Pato name remained untarnished. But now, with her husband's sudden illness, she felt an unfamiliar sense of helplessness. She had always relied on Pato's strength, his unwavering determination. The thought of him being weak, of him being vulnerable, was almost too much to bear. As she sat there, lost in thought, the door opened, and Zoe entered the room. She was carrying a small sketchpad, her fingers stained with ink. Zoe had always been the sensitive one, the artist who saw the world in colors and shapes rather than numbers and deals. Mrs. Pato loved her deeply, though she sometimes worried about her daughter's future. In a family like theirs, with its focus on power and wealth, Zoe's artistic dreams often seemed out of place. "Mom," Zoe began hesitantly, her voice soft, "I'm worried about Dad." Mrs. Pato looked up, her heart aching at the sight of her youngest daughter's worried expression. "I know, my dear. We all are." Zoe sat down next to her mother, her sketchpad forgotten. "Do you think he's really sick? I mean, he didn't seem that different before he told us. What if there's something else going on?" Mrs. Pato frowned, her mind racing. She had been so focused on her own fears that she hadn't considered the possibility that her husband might be hiding something. But what could it be? What could be so important that he would pretend to be ill? "I don't know, Zoe," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Your father has always been a strong man. I find it hard to believe that he would be taken down so easily by an illness. But whatever is going on, we need to support him. We need to be there for him, no matter what." Zoe nodded, though she still looked troubled. "I just hope he's okay, Mom. I don't want to lose him." Mrs. Pato pulled her daughter into a hug, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't want to lose him either. But as the doubts continued to swirl in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that their family was on the brink of something terrible. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in a warm orange glow, Mr. Pato stood in his study, gazing out at the garden. He had seen the way his family had reacted to his announcement, the way doubt and fear had taken root. It pained him to deceive them, but he had to know, he had to be sure of their loyalty, of their ability to handle the responsibilities that would one day fall on their shoulders. But as he watched the shadows lengthen, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. He had wanted to test his family, to see their true colors. But in doing so, he had sown the seeds of doubt and mistrust, seeds that could grow into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. As night fell, the Pato family retreated to their rooms, each one lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The peace and unity that had once defined their family were beginning to unravel, replaced by uncertainty and doubt. And though none of them knew it yet, the events of that day would set in motion a series of betrayals, secrets, and conflicts that would change their lives forever. The days following Mr. Pato's announcement were heavy with tension. The once lively Pato mansion, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, now echoed with silence. The family was beginning to unravel under the weight of Mr. Pato's supposed illness, each member struggling with their own doubts and fears. Tammy was the first to notice that something was amiss. As she took on more responsibilities at the family business, she began to sense an undercurrent of mistrust among the senior staff. They were no longer as forthcoming as they had once been, and she could feel their eyes on her, watching, judging. It was as if they were waiting for her to fail, to prove that she wasn't capable of stepping into her father's shoes. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Tammy decided to confront one of her father's oldest and most trusted advisors, Mr. Muru. He had always been a mentor to her, guiding her as she learned the ropes of the business. But lately, he had been distant, and Tammy couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. Mr. Mburu, Tammy began as she caught up with him in the hallway after the meeting, "I need to talk to you." Mr. Mburu paused, his face betraying a flicker of surprise before he composed himself. "Of course, Tammy. What's on your mind?" Tammy hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject. "I've noticed that things have been different around here lately. People seem distant. And I can't help but feel like there's something going on that I'm not aware of." Mr. Mburu's expression remained carefully neutral, but Tammy could see the tension in his eyes. "What do you mean, Tammy?" "Everyone is just adjusting to the changes. It's a difficult time for all of us." Tammy narrowed her eyes, sensing that he was holding something back. "I don't believe that's all there is to it, Mr. Mburu. If there's something I need to know, now is the time to tell me. I'm in charge now, and I need to be prepared for whatever comes our way." For a moment, it seemed as if Mr. Mburu was going to deny it again. But then, with a heavy sigh, he relented. "Tammy, there are rumors. Whispers among the staff that your father isn't as sick as he claims to be. Some believe that he's testing you, to see if you're ready to take over." Tammy felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The doubts that Kamal had voiced just days earlier came rushing back, stronger than ever. "Testing me," she repeated, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why would he do that? Why not just tell me what he wants?" Mr. Mburu's gaze softened as he looked at her, the mentor who had always believed in her potential. "Your father is a complicated man, Tammy. He has his reasons, though they may not always make sense to us. He's built this empire from nothing, and it's everything to him. He needs to be sure that whoever takes over is strong enough to handle it." Tammy clenched her fist, her mind racing. So it was true, her father was pretending to be ill, all to test her loyalty and strength. The betrayal cut deep, filling her with a burning resolve. If this was a test, she would not fail. She would prove to her father, and to everyone else, that she was more than capable of carrying on the Pato legacy. But as she left the office that evening, her resolve was tainted by a bitter anger. Her father had always been her hero, the one person she could rely on no matter what. But now, she felt like a pawn in his game, manipulated and used. And though she was determined to prove herself, a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind questioned whether this was the beginning of the end for their once unshakable bond. Back at the mansion, Kamal was struggling with his own demands. Unlike Tammy, he had never cared much for the family business. But the thought of his father deceiving them, of using them as pawns in some elaborate test, filled him with a rage he didn't know how to contain. He had always admired his father's strength, his determination to protect the family at all costs. But now, that admiration was clouded by resentment. One evening, unable to keep his frustration to himself any longer, Kamal confronted his mother in the living room. Mrs. Pato was sitting in her favorite armchair, a book in her hands, though she wasn't really reading. She looked up as Kamal stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "I need to talk to you about Dad." Mrs. Pato put down her book, concern etched across her features. "What is it, Kamal? What's wrong?" Kamal paced the room, his thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic mess. "I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening. About Dad's illness, or whatever it is he's pretending it is." Mrs. Potter's eyes widened in shock. "Kamal, what are you saying? Your father isn't pretending. He's sick. No, Mom, he's not. Kamal cut her off, his voice rising in anger. He's lying to us, testing us. It's all some elaborate game to him. And we're just the pawns he's moving around on his chessboard. Mrs. Pato stared at her son, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always trusted her husband implicitly, never questioning his decisions. But now, hearing Kamal's words, a seed of doubt began to take root in her mind. Why would he do that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because that's who he is, Kamal replied bitterly. He's always been about control, about making sure everything goes his way. And now, he's trying to control us, to see if we're worthy of carrying on the Pato name. Mrs. Pato felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had always known her husband as a strong, determined man, but the thought of him deceiving them like this, of playing with their emotions, was almost too much to bear. I can't believe you would do that, she murmured, more to herself than to Kamal. He loves us. He wouldn't hurt us like this. Kamal shook his head, his anger giving way to a deep sadness. I don't know, Mom. But something's not right. And we need to figure out what's really going on before it tears us apart. Mrs. Pato sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She wanted to defend her husband, to believe that he would never betray them in such a cruel way. But the doubts planted by Kamal's words were growing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her family was on the brink of something terrible. As the days passed, the tension in the Pato household grew. Tammy threw herself into her work, determined to prove herself, while Kamal distanced himself from the family, unable to hide his resentment. Zoe, sensitive to the change in the atmosphere, retreated into her art, using it as an escape from the growing turmoil around her. And Mrs. Pato, torn between her love for her husband and the doubts gnawing at her heart, found herself drifting further and further from the man she had spent her life with. She couldn't bring herself to confront him, to ask him outright if the illness was a lie. Instead, she watched him carefully, searching for any sign that would confirm or dispel her fears. Mr. Pato, for his part, continued with his charade, unaware of the storm brewing within his family. He thought he was in control, that he was testing his family's loyalty and strength. But in reality, his deception was slowly poisoning the very bonds he had sought to protect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in shadows, Mrs. Pato finally decided to speak to her husband. She found him in his study, the room dimly lit by a single lamp on his desk. He looked up as she entered, a small smile playing on his lips. "Hello, my dear," he greeted her warmly. "How was your day?" Mrs. Pato forced a smile, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation she was about to have. "It was fine," she replied, her voice calm. "But I've been thinking, Pato, about everything that's been happening lately." Mr. Pato raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension in her voice. "What's on your mind?" Mrs. Pato took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been worried about you. About your health. And I've been wondering if there's something you're not telling me." Mr. Pato's smile faltered, but he quickly composed himself. "What do you mean, darling? I've told you everything you need to know." But Mrs. Pato wasn't convinced. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze. "Pato, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "If there's something going on, I need to know. We're in this together, remember?" For a moment, it seemed as if Mr. Pato was going to confess, to tell her everything. But then, he shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "There's nothing more to tell, my love. You're worrying over nothing. Mrs. Pato nodded, though her heart ached with the weight of unspoken truths. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the man she had built a life with. But the doubts remained, festering like a wound that refused to heal. As she left the study that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her family was standing on the edge of a precipice, and that one wrong step would send them all tumbling into the abyss. And so, the seeds of betrayal and mistrust continued to grow, threatening to destroy the Pato family from within. None of them knew it yet, but the events that were set in motion by Mr. Pato's deception would lead to a series of conflicts and betrayals that would forever change their lives. And as the shadows lengthened over the Pato estate, the once unbreakable bonds of family were beginning to unravel, leaving them vulnerable to the storms that were yet to come. The sun set over the sprawling Pato estate, casting long shadows that seemed to reflect the deepening gloom within the family. Inside the mansion, a suffocating silence had taken hold, broken only by the occasional rustle of curtains or the distant echo of footsteps. The family, once so close-knit and vibrant, was now on the verge of unraveling, each member locked in their own world of doubt and suspicion. Mrs. Pato sat in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't silence. Every conversation, every glance from her husband, now seemed loaded with hidden meaning. She wanted to dismiss Kamal's accusations as mere paranoia, but her instincts told her otherwise. There was something her husband wasn't telling her, and it gnawed at her, day and night. Across the mansion, Mr. Pato sat in his study, pretending to read a book he had no interest in. His mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with the game he had set in motion. He had believed that by faking his illness, he could test his family's loyalty, see who was truly capable of stepping up to protect the Pato legacy. But as the days passed, he found himself questioning his own actions. He could feel the distance growing between him and his wife, a distance he hadn't anticipated. Late that night, Mrs. Pato found herself wandering the darkened hallways of the mansion, unable to sleep. She had always been a strong woman, the backbone of the family, but now she felt lost. Her husband, the man she had loved and trusted for so many years, was slipping away from her. She didn't know how to reach him, or if she even wanted to. As she passed by the study, she noticed a faint light seeping out from under the door. Curious, she gently pushed the door open and found her husband sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a piece of paper. His face was drawn, tired, and for the first time in a long while, he looked old to her, like the weight of the world was resting on his shoulders. "Pato," she called softly, stepping into the room. He looked up, startled, as if he had been caught in the act of something secretive. "Darling, what are you doing up so late?" he asked, quickly folding the paper and tucking it away. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her voice gentle but probing. She walked over to him, her eyes scanning his face, searching for answers. "You've been so distant lately, Pato. I can't help but feel like you're hiding something from me." Mr. Pato forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're imagining things, my dear. It's just the stress of everything. I'm fine, really." But Mrs. Pato wasn't convinced. She had seen the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze. "Pato, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm your wife. We've always faced everything together. If there's something wrong, you need to tell me. I can't keep living in this state of uncertainty." For a moment, Mr. Pato was silent, the weight of his deception pressing down on him like a heavy burden. He could see the pain in his wife's eyes, the desperation to understand what was happening. Part of him wanted to come clean, to admit that his illness was a ruse, but he knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. The trust they had built over the years would be shattered. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry, darling," he said softly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to make sure that the family would be okay, that the legacy we've worked so hard to build would be safe." Mrs. Pato frowned, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean, Pato? What are you talking about?" Mr. Pato hesitated, knowing that he was walking a fine line. He had to choose his words carefully. "I've been worried about the future," he admitted. "About what would happen if something were to happen to me. I wanted to see if the family would be able to handle it, if they would step up and protect what we've built." Mrs. Pato's eyes widened in realization. "So, all of this, your illness, it was just a test." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "In a way, yes," he confessed. "But I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could control it, that I could handle the situation. But now, I don't know anymore." The room seemed to close in around Mrs. Pato as the weight of his words sank in. She had spent weeks, months, worrying about her husband, thinking that he was gravely ill, when all along it had been a lie. A test. Anger flared up inside her, mixing with the hurt and betrayal. "How could you do this to us, Pato?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "How could you lie to me, to our children? We've been living in fear, thinking we were going to lose you, and all for what? A test." Mr. Pato winced at the harshness in her voice, knowing that he deserved it. "I never wanted to hurt you," he repeated, his own voice thick with regret. I wanted to be sure." "Sure of what?" she snapped, pulling her hand away from his. "Sure that we could handle things without you. Sure that we loved you enough to pass your twisted little test. How could you even think that this was the right thing to do?" Mr. Pato bowed his head, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had thought that he was doing what was best for the family, but now, seeing the pain in his wife's eyes, he realized that he had only succeeded in tearing them apart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've made a terrible mistake." Mrs. Pato stared at him, her heart torn between the love she still felt for him and the anger that burned inside her. "You have," she said coldly. "And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for it." With that, she turned and walked out of the study, leaving Mr. Pato alone with his regrets. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but it felt to him like the slamming of a prison gate, locking him into the mess he had created. As she made her way back to their bedroom, Mrs. Pato felt a coldness settle over her. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved for so many years, had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. And now, she didn't know if they could ever find their way back to each other. That night, they slept in separate beds, the distance between them growing ever wider. And though the truth had finally been revealed, it brought with it no comfort, only the chilling realization that the Pato family was more fragile than any of them had ever imagined. The morning sun rose on a house filled with uncertainty, the once solid foundation of the Pato family now riddled with cracks. And as the days passed, those cracks only grew deeper, threatening to shatter everything they had once held dear. The tension in the Pato household had become palpable. Every interaction was tinged with suspicion, every glance heavy with unspoken questions. Mrs. Pato moved through the grand halls of the estate like a ghost, her once warm and nurturing demeanor replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. She had always prided herself on being able to read people, but now she found herself at a loss, unsure of who to trust, even within her own family. Mr. Pato, on the other hand, tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He threw himself into work, hosting meetings with business partners and entertaining guests, all while pretending that the rift between him and his wife didn't exist. But beneath the surface, he was deeply troubled. He had lost something vital in his relationship with Mrs. Pato, something that might never be recovered. And though he tried to reassure himself that it had all been necessary, that he had done what he had to do to protect the family, the guilt gnawed at him. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice the strain. Tammy, the eldest daughter, was particularly perceptive. She had always looked up to her parents, admired their partnership and the way they seemed to complement each other in everything. But now, she sensed the distance between them, an underlying tension that made her uneasy. One evening, as Tammy was preparing dinner in the kitchen, her younger brother, Kito, came in, frowning. "Tammy, have you noticed how weird things have been lately?" Kito asked, his voice tinged with concern. Tammy sighed, her hands pausing as she chopped vegetables. "Yes, I have. I don't know what's going on, but something's definitely wrong." Kito leaned against the counter, his brow furrowed. "I heard Mom and Dad arguing the other night." "It was bad, Tammy. I've never heard them fight like that before." Tammy's heart sank. "What were they arguing about?" "I'm not sure," Kito admitted. "But I heard Mom say something about a test, and that Dad lied to us." "Do you think Dad did something?" Tammy's mind raced. A test. Lies. It didn't make sense. Her father had always been a man of integrity, someone who valued honesty above all else. But the way her mother had been acting lately, distant and guarded, it added up to something troubling. "I don't know, Kito," Tammy said quietly. "But I'm going to find out." Later that night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, Tammy crept down to her father's study. She had always been the inquisitive one in the family, never content to let things lie when something seemed off. And now, she was determined to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. The study was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the desk. Tammy's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. Her gaze fell on a stack of papers on the desk, and she hesitated before moving closer. She didn't want to invade her father's privacy, but she knew she had to if she wanted to understand what was tearing their family apart. As she sifted through the papers, her breath caught in her throat. There, among the documents, was a medical report, one that confirmed her father's illness. But something wasn't right. The dates didn't match up, and there were discrepancies in the details. It was as if the report had been doctored, altered to show something that wasn't true. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the implications. Her father had faked his illness. But why? And what had he hoped to gain by doing so? Just as she was about to put the papers back, the door creaked open, and Tammy's heart leaped into her throat. She quickly stuffed the report back into the pile and turned to face her father, who stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Tammy, what are you doing?" Mr. Pato's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her nervous. I was just..." Tammy stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. But the look in her father's eyes told her he already knew the truth. Mr. Pato sighed, walking over to the desk and sitting down. "You were looking for answers, weren't you?" Tammy nodded, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Dad, why did you fake your illness? What's going on?" Mr. Pato rubbed his temples, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. "It's complicated, Tammy. I did what I thought was necessary to protect this family. But how could lying to us protect us?" Tammy's voice was filled with hurt. "Don't you trust us?" "It's not about trust," Mr. Pato said, his tone heavy. It's about survival. This family has enemies, Tammy. People who would do anything to bring us down. I needed to know who was loyal, who I could rely on when things got tough. Tammy's mind reeled. She had known her family was powerful, that her father's business dealings weren't always above board, but she had never imagined the extent of the danger they were in. So you pretended to be sick to see who would stay by your side, she asked, struggling to understand. Mr. Pato nodded. Yes. And I'm sorry for putting you all through that. But I had to be sure. I had to know who I could trust. Tammy felt a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside her. She had always trusted her father, believed in him, but now that trust was shattered. You didn't have to lie to us, Dad. We would have stood by you no matter what. Mr. Pato reached out to take her hand, his eyes pleading. I know, Tammy. And I regret how I went about it. But please, understand that I did it for the family, for you and your siblings. Tammy pulled her hand away, shaking her head. You've hurt us, Dad. You've hurt Mom. And I don't know if we can ever forgive you for that. Mr. Pato's face crumpled with regret, but he didn't try to stop her as she turned and walked out of the study. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room, haunted by the consequences of his actions. As Tammy made her way back to her room, she felt a deep sense of loss. The man she had admired and looked up to her entire life had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And as much as she wanted to believe that he had done it for the right reasons, she couldn't shake the feeling that their family would never be the same again. The next morning, over breakfast, the tension was palpable. Tammy and Mr. Pato exchanged strained glances, neither of them willing to bring up the conversation from the night before. Mrs. Pato, noticing the shift in the air, looked from her daughter to her husband with a mixture of suspicion and concern. What's going on? She asked, her voice sharp. Tammy hesitated, unsure of how much she should reveal. But before she could answer, Mr. Pato spoke up. Nothing, dear. Just some business matters that Tammy was curious about. It's nothing to worry about. But Mrs. Pato wasn't convinced. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that something was very wrong. Are you sure that's all it is? She pressed, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Pato forced a smile. I promise, it's nothing you need to concern yourself with. Everything is under control. Mrs. Pato's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned back to her breakfast, though the doubt in her mind remained. She knew her husband was hiding something from her, and she was determined to find out what it was. Later that day, as Tammy was getting ready to leave the house, she was stopped by Kamal, the family's longtime confidant and advisor. Tammy, can I have a word? He asked, his voice low. Tammy nodded, following him into one of the empty rooms. What is it, Kamal? Kamal looked around, as if making sure they were alone, before speaking. I overheard you and your father talking last night. I know about the fake illness. Tammy's heart skipped a beat. You heard that? Kamal nodded. I did. And I think you should know that this isn't the first time your father has done something like this. Tammy's eyes widened in shock. What do you mean? Kamal hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Your father has always been a master at manipulation. He's used these kinds of tactics before, to test the loyalty of his associates, his business partners, even his family. But this time, I think he may have gone too far. Tammy's mind raced as she tried to process what Kamal was telling her. If this was true, then her father had been playing games with their lives for years, manipulating them like pawns on a chessboard. "Why are you telling me this, Kamal?" Kamal's expression softened. "Because I care about this family, Tammy. I've been with you all for a long time, and I don't want to see you get hurt. I think it's time you and your mother knew the full truth." Tammy's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the gravity of the situation. Her father had been lying to them all along, using them to further his own agenda. And now, she had to decide whether to confront him or keep the truth hidden for the sake of the family. As she left the room, her mind was in turmoil. The Pato family was unraveling before her eyes, and she didn't know how to stop it. All she knew was that the truth was a dangerous thing, and once it was out, there would be no going back. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sprawling Pato estate. The once lively household, filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed cloaked in a shroud of unease. Mrs. Pato sat in the grand living room, absently swirling a glass of wine. Her mind was heavy with doubts, suspicions that had taken root and were now spreading like a dark stain through her thoughts. Her husband, Mr. Pato, had always been the pillar of the family, a man of strength, integrity, and unwavering resolve. But recently, something had shifted. There was a distance in his eyes, a guardedness in his words that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. And then there was Tammy, their daughter, who had grown more withdrawn, her once cheerful demeanor replaced by a somber silence. Mrs. Pato couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but every time she tried to broach the subject with her husband, he brushed her off with vague reassurances. "It's nothing to worry about," he'd say with that same disarming smile that once put her at ease. But now, it only deepened her mistrust. As she sat there, lost in thought, the door to the living room creaked open, and Tammy entered, her face pale and drawn. Mrs. Pato looked up, instantly sensing her daughter's distress. "Tammy, darling, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Tammy hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But she knew there was no avoiding this conversation any longer. She had to tell her mother the truth. "Mom, we need to talk," Tammy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Pato's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, dear? You're scaring me." Tammy took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It's about Dad. There's something you need to know." Mrs. Pato's grip tightened on her glass. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Tammy sat down beside her mother, her hands trembling slightly. "Dad's been lying to us, Mom. He pretended to be sick." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Mrs. Pato blinked, trying to process what her daughter had just said. "Pretended? What do you mean, pretended?" Tammy reached out and took her mother's hand, her voice breaking with emotion. "I found the medical report, Mom. It was faked. Dad's not sick. He did it to test us, to see who was loyal." For a moment, Mrs. Pato couldn't speak. The room seemed to tilt around her as the realization sank in. The man she had loved, the man she had stood by for all these years, had deceived her in the most profound way. A cold fury began to rise within her, mingling with the hurt and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm her. He tested us," she repeated, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Tammy nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, Mom. He's been playing games with all of us. And I don't know why." Mrs. Pato stood up abruptly, the glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. The sound echoed through the room, but neither of them moved to clean it up. Her hands clenched into fists, and her breathing grew heavy as she fought to control the storm of emotions raging inside her. How could he do this to us? She spat, her voice seething with anger. How could he lie to me, to his own family? Tammy rose to her feet, placing a comforting hand on her mother's arm. I don't know, Mom. But we need to figure out what we are going to do. We can't just pretend like nothing's happened. Mrs. Pato turned to her daughter, her eyes blazing with determination. You're right, Tammy. We can't let him get away with this. We have to confront him, make him understand the damage he's done. At that moment, the door to the living room opened again, and Mr. Pato stepped inside, his usual confident expression faltering when he saw the shattered glass on the floor and the looks on his wife and daughter's faces. What's going on? He asked, his voice weary. Mrs. Pato fixed him with a steely gaze, her voice cold as ice. We know, Pato. We know everything. Mr. Pato's face paled, and for the first time, he looked truly afraid. What do you mean? Tammy stepped forward, her voice firm. We know about the fake illness, Dad. We know you've been lying to us. There was a tense silence as Mr. Pato's eyes darted between his wife and daughter, his mind racing to come up with an explanation, an excuse, anything to defuse the situation. But there was no way out of this. The truth had finally caught up to him. I did it for the family, he stammered, his voice lacking the conviction it once had. I had to know who I could trust. I needed to protect us. Protect us. Mrs. Pato's voice was sharp with incredulity. You call this protection? You lied to us, manipulated us, and now you're trying to justify it as some twisted act of love. Mr. Pato's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. I never meant to hurt you, he said weakly. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? Mrs. Pato's voice rose, filled with fury. The right thing would have been to trust us, to be honest with us. But instead, you chose to betray us. Tammy watched as her parents confronted each other, her heart breaking at the sight. She had always believed in the strength of her family, in the bond they shared, but now it seemed like everything was falling apart. Mr. Pato sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. But the apology felt hollow, like a weak attempt to patch over a wound that ran too deep. Mrs. Pato shook her head, her expression one of sorrow and disappointment. Sorry isn't enough, Pato. You've destroyed the trust in this family. And I don't know if we can ever get it back. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and for the first time, Mr. Pato truly understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had wanted to protect his family, but in the process, he had torn them apart. Tammy moved to her mother's side, wrapping her arms around her in a gesture of comfort. We'll get through this, Mom, she said softly. We'll figure it out. Mrs. Pato nodded, though her eyes were filled with unshed tears. I just don't know where we go from here. As they stood there, the shattered pieces of glass on the floor seemed to symbolize the state of their family, broken, fragile, and in desperate need of repair. But whether they could ever truly mend what had been torn apart remained to be seen. And as the night wore on, the Pato family found themselves facing an uncertain future, one where the foundations of trust and loyalty had been shaken to their core.